Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
In 1996, in a small rural town in Nebraska, there was an elementary school known more for its age than its academics. It was the kind of place where paint peeled off lockers, the floors creaked under the weight of every step, and the windows whined with every gust of wind. But Room 104, an old, unused classroom tucked at the end of the west hallway, had a reputation that teachers refused to talk about and students dared each other to approach. The classroom had been locked for over 20 years. The story went that in 1975, a teacher named Miss Adler taught in that room. She was strict, quiet, and lived alone just outside town. One winter morning, she came in, sat at her desk, and never got back up. Her heart had stopped sometime during first period, her lifeless body sitting stiffly in her chair, while her students sat silently, unsure of what was happening. No one noticed for hours. The trauma was so deep, the school never used the room again. They sealed the door, and slowly, people stopped talking about it. But in 1996, the school underwent renovations. A group of contractors was sent in to refurbish the West Wing, and Room 104 was to be reopened and used again. The janitor at the time, a man named Earl, reportedly refused to unlock the room. He claimed the lock wasn't normal, that no matter how many times he changed it, it would relock itself by morning. The principal, growing frustrated, eventually ordered a locksmith. The room was opened. That same week, strange things began happening. A third-grade teacher, Mrs. Kallman, was assigned to Room 104. Her students were young, excitable, and mostly unaware of the room's history. But the change was immediate. One student, a quiet boy named Mason, started crying uncontrollably the moment he entered the room. He said the woman at the desk was staring at him. The desk was empty. Another girl, Julia, refused to enter at all, whispering to her mother that the chalkboard bleeds at night. Mrs. Kallman tried to ignore it. The school chalked it up to overactive imaginations and local gossip. But she started noticing things too. The classroom clock always stopped at 9:13 a.m., the exact time Miss Adler had died, according to the old police report. Papers would go missing and reappear hours later with different handwriting. Once, while grading after school, she heard the unmistakable sound of chalk scraping across the blackboard. When she turned around, the words, "I never left," were written in a jagged, frantic scrawl. She erased it. The next morning, it was back, written in red. The final straw came on a snowy Thursday in January. The class was sitting quietly, heads down in an art project. Mrs. Kallman stepped out for just a moment to grab supplies. When she came back, the lights were off, the blinds shut tight, and every student sat frozen, eyes wide, unmoving like dolls. She flipped on the lights and demanded to know what was going on, but they wouldn't speak. It took the counselor 3 days to get anything out of them. What the children said was consistent across every account. A woman had come out from behind the teacher's desk, walked silently between the rows of desks, and whispered each of their names. But no one could describe her face. Room 104 was closed the next day. This time, it was welded shut. Teachers and staff were told to stop spreading rumors, and students were quietly reassigned to different rooms. Years later, in 2008, a high school student writing a report on local history snuck into the school during winter break. He found Room 104, still sealed. He brought a camera and recorded his attempt to open the door. He never got it open. But the footage, later found on his camera, captured something else entirely. As he approached the door, the camera picks up the sound of slow, steady breathing, not his. Then a whisper directly into the mic. "Class is in session." The camera cuts out. He was never seen again.
Story number 2.
In 2013, a middle school in upstate New York called Fair Hill Intermediate quietly shut down one of its oldest classrooms, Room B12, without any formal explanation. Teachers were told it was due to asbestos. But that was a lie. The truth was much stranger. Room B12 had been used for decades as the detention room. Students who acted out were sent there to sit in silence, supervised by rotating staff. It was a gray, sterile space, low ceiling, flickering overhead lights, and a single window that barely let in any light. There was something off about the room, even before things went wrong. The first real incident happened in late October. A seventh grader named Lauren was sent to detention for talking back to a substitute teacher. She was quiet when she came out, too quiet. Her parents noticed she stopped sleeping through the night. They found her sitting upright in bed, eyes open, whispering to someone who wasn't there. When asked, Lauren said she was talking to the kid in the corner. At first, they thought it was imaginary, but her behavior changed completely. She drew strange symbols, began repeating phrases backward, and had violent outbursts without warning. Then another student, David, was sent to B12. He didn't come back. The teacher supervising that day claimed David walked into the room, sat down, and just disappeared. His desk was empty. His backpack and coat were still there, but he was gone. The school went into lockdown. Police were called. They searched the entire campus, combed through security footage, but the cameras in that wing had cut out for exactly 17 minutes, starting the moment David entered the room. They never found him. After that, detention was moved to the library. B12 was quietly abandoned, door locked, and left unmarked. But things didn't stop. Custodians reported hearing a loud thudding coming from the room at night, like someone throwing themselves against the walls. Sometimes, soft whispers filtered out into the hallway. One janitor claimed he saw the doorknob slowly turning, even though no one was inside. By January, teachers started getting anonymous notes in their mailboxes. Each note had the same message, written in childish handwriting. "Let us out. We're still here." At first, the school thought it was a prank, but the notes kept coming and eventually included names: Lauren's, David's, and others no one recognized. Names that matched children who had gone missing in the district over the past 30 years. The district sealed off the entire basement wing. The school kept operating, but room B12 became something everyone knew not to mention. Students dared each other to knock on the door. Some claimed they could hear someone knocking back. In 2019, a new principal took over, someone who hadn't heard the rumors. She had the wing reopened for storage. Maintenance workers were sent down to clear it out. Only one of them came back. His story was erratic. He kept repeating that the room was wrong, that the walls weren't the same as when he went in. He said it was like a mirror maze. No windows, no doors once you were inside. He claimed he saw kids standing in the corners, unmoving, staring at him. Some were missing eyes. Others had mouths stitched shut. The last thing he said before being committed was that they weren't dead. They were waiting. Room B12 was welded shut the next day. But sometimes, even now, students say if you walk by the old hallway just before the last bell, right around 3:06 p.m., you can hear scratching from behind the door, and sometimes just barely a voice. Please don't forget.
Story number 3.
In 2005, at a public high school in Oregon, a strange policy was introduced without warning. Classroom 2C was to remain locked at all times unless a teacher was present, and absolutely no students were allowed inside unsupervised. There was no explanation, just a sudden, strict rule. Classroom 2C had always been a little strange, even before the policy. Teachers who taught there complained of a persistent chill, no matter the season. The heating system worked fine in the rest of the building, but not in 2C. Substitutes often refused to return after a single day there, claiming something about the room made them feel watched. The real horror began with Mr. Harmon, a young English teacher in his first year of teaching. Eager to impress and not one to believe in ghost stories, he volunteered to take over 2C when the previous teacher abruptly transferred schools mid-year. He lasted exactly 3 weeks. According to students, Mr. Pack, Harmon started off energetic and warm, full of jokes and passion for literature. But after a few days in 2C, his demeanor changed. He grew pale, jumpy. He began locking the door during class and refused to let students sit near the back wall, especially the far left corner. One student, Jake, told his friends Mr. Harmon would stare at that corner during lectures like he was waiting for something to move. On the Friday before he disappeared, Mr. Jack Harmon showed up with deep scratches on his neck. He claimed he fell, but a student swore they saw the wounds form during class, thin red lines appearing one by one as Mr. Harmon tried to continue teaching Macbeth. That Monday, he didn't show up. His car was still in the parking lot. His keys and wallet were on his desk. Security footage showed him entering the classroom at 7:18 a.m. and never coming back out. When the police arrived, The classroom was empty, all except for a single piece of chalk, broken in half, resting on the middle of the floor. The classroom was sealed again. Rumors swirled. One of the janitors who'd been working there since the 90s claimed this wasn't the first time a teacher had vanished in that room. She said every few years, someone new would come in, the room would choose them, and then they'd disappear. Not drop out, not quit, disappear. A few months later, students dared a classmate, Natalie, to sneak in after hours. She picked the lock with a hairpin and filmed herself walking inside with her phone flashlight. The footage made its way online, but no one knows where the original file is now. What's left is only a few seconds, grainy and corrupted. In the video, she walks around, giggling nervously. The desks are all stacked in the back, like someone tried to clear the space. She pans the camera toward the corner, that corner. There's something crouched there, barely visible. It's not quite human. It looks like it's made of shadow, yet has depth. As the camera zooms in, it turns its head slowly, and two pinpricks of white light blink where eyes should be. Then it lunges. Natalie was found the next day, unconscious in the school basement, curled into a fetal position. Her hair had turned completely white. She never spoke again. Today, 2C remains locked, its windows blacked out, its number plate removed. Staff refer to it only as the room. New teachers are warned during orientation. If you hear someone knocking from inside, know you didn't. And if the door ever opens on its own, run.
Story number 4.
In 2010, in a quiet town in Illinois, a middle school named Windrow Academy began experiencing a pattern so strange, it was almost ignored, until it escalated into something no one could explain. It started with the fire alarm in room 8B. Every Thursday at exactly 2:11 p.m., the alarm would go off for that room only. It wasn't loud, more like a soft, distant ringing, and only the students and teacher inside could hear it. At first, the administration thought it was a prank or a faulty wire. Electricians were brought in. They checked the circuits, replaced the panel, even rewired the room entirely. But the sound persisted. Same time, every Thursday. The strangest part? The teacher, Miss Lee, noticed that whenever the sound started, her students stopped moving. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowed down, like video buffering on a bad connection. She said their heads would turn more slowly, their eyes blinked less, and their voices took on an unnatural slurred quality, as if they were talking underwater. And then, after exactly 3 minutes, everything returned to normal. The students never remembered it happening. Then came the drawings. During a routine art project, several kids from 8B started drawing the exact same image without any prior discussion or guidance. It showed a classroom, clearly 8B, lit by dim orange light, with all the desks empty except one. In that desk sat a child with no face, just smooth skin where eyes and a mouth should be. Around the edges of the drawings were crude symbols, like ancient runes, all identical down to the last detail. Some weren't even visible to the naked eye until someone noticed strange impressions on the back of the paper under certain lighting. Concerned? Miss Lasserow. Lee went through the school's archives and discovered something horrifying. In 1982, a student named Daniel Mertz had gone missing from room 8B during last period on a Thursday. Witnesses claimed they looked away for a moment, and when they turned back, he was gone. No one saw him leave. No one heard a thing. The case was closed with no leads, and room 8B was remodeled a year later. After finding his picture in an old yearbook, Mr. Back, Lee showed it to her students, asking if anyone recognized him. Several kids said he looked familiar. One girl said he'd been sitting next to her all semester, but there was no student in that seat. Security footage confirmed it. No one had been sitting there. The final incident occurred on a rainy Thursday in April. Miss Lee, having had enough, decided to stay in the classroom during the 2:11 alarm. She set up a voice recorder and a video camera aimed at the desk that was always empty. That afternoon, the sound began. Her students froze. She tried to speak but couldn't move. The clock on the wall ticked backward. The footage was recovered days later. It showed Ms. Lee standing perfectly still as a figure slowly rose from the empty desk. It looked like a boy, but his movements were jagged, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. He walked up to her and whispered something into her ear. Then the camera cut out. Ms. Lee was found the next morning, sitting in her car in the school parking lot, doors locked, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were split open. She was whispering the same phrase over and over again. He never left. He never left. He never left. She was hospitalized and never returned to teaching. Room 8B was sealed after that. Students say if you pass it on a Thursday afternoon and put your ear to the door, you can still hear the faint ring of the fire alarm, followed by a child's voice whispering your name, even if you've never been in that room before, especially if you have.
Story number 5.
In 1999, a private boarding school in Vermont called Elderwood Hall quietly removed a small classroom from its official building plans. Room D3 was no longer listed on maps, no longer used for teaching, and no longer mentioned in staff meetings. But it still existed, at the end of the East Wing hallway, down a few steps that always seemed colder than the rest of the school. Before it was shut down, D3 had been used as a homeroom for advanced placement students. The last class to use it was a group of 12. Bright, ambitious kids. All of them were part of a project called the Reflection Assignment, a year-long psychological study created by a professor from the nearby university. The assignment was simple on paper. Each student was to write in a personal journal every day, recording not only their thoughts, but any dreams, strange feelings, or changes in perception. The school agreed to the experiment under the condition that it wouldn't interfere with academics. At first, it didn't, but then the students began to change. It started small. One student, Maria, stopped sleeping, not because she couldn't, but because she claimed the person in her dreams wasn't her. She said it was someone who looked like her, moved like her, but didn't think like her. That this version of her would whisper things in the night, things she couldn't remember upon waking. Another student, Keith, became obsessed with mirrors. He asked the janitor to cover the one in the boys' bathroom and was caught carrying a black cloth to drape over the glass in his locker. When pressed, he said the reflections in D3 weren't accurate, that they were a beat behind. He said if you watched long enough, your reflection would start doing things you weren't doing. One night, just before winter break, a janitor heard footsteps in the East Wing well after curfew. When he followed the sound, he saw a light under the door of D3. The classroom had been dark for weeks. When he opened the door, no one was there. Just 12 journals stacked neatly on the floor in a perfect circle. All of them were open to the same page. The entries were written in identical handwriting, even though every student had a distinct style. Each page read, "The version of me in the mirror wants out." The school contacted the university professor who had created the assignment, but when they tried to reach him, they discovered something chilling. He had died 6 months before the project ever began. Car accident. The professor who had introduced the study had been an imposter. No one could figure out who he really was. The records, the emails, the correspondence, all of it led to a dead man. In the first week of January, the 12 students were called back for counseling. One never showed up. Her dorm was locked from the inside, and when they broke down the door, all they found was a single mirror, propped up on her desk. Her reflection was there, but she wasn't. The others followed, one by one, disappearing into locked rooms, vanishing during class, leaving behind nothing but their journals and reflections that didn't blink in time. By February, all 12 were gone. Room D3 was sealed, the steps to it removed, the hallway boarded up. Teachers were told it had been converted into storage, but anyone who worked there long enough knew better. Years later, a freshman named Caleb found the staircase by accident while exploring during a snowstorm lockdown. He went down, found the boarded-up door, and knocked, just once. Someone knocked back. He recorded the audio on his phone. You can still find the clip online if you dig deep enough. At the end of the recording, a voice, his own voice, can be heard whispering, "He's behind you." Caleb was found unconscious at the top of the stairs. When he woke up, he couldn't speak. His tongue had been cleanly severed. The doctors say it looked surgically removed, but there was no blood, no wound. And when they wheeled him past a mirror in the hospital hallway, he screamed so loud the lights flickered, because his reflection didn't.
Story number 6.
In 2014, a suburban high school in Ohio experienced a strange occurrence that would later become one of its darkest and most haunting secrets. It all began in the library, an old sprawling building with walls lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. The library had always been a quiet, peaceful place for students to study and escape, but there was one particular corner in the back of the room that had a reputation, the Forgotten Alcove. No one really knew why it was called that, but every student who sat there for too long came out with unsettling stories of what they had seen, or thought they had seen. It was just a small, semi-hidden space tucked between two tall rows of bookshelves. A couple of chairs were pushed together near the back wall. No one could ever figure out how the alcove had remained mostly undisturbed for years, even though the rest of the library was always filled with students. But then, in the fall of 2014, something happened. A shy sophomore named Claire took a seat in the alcove one afternoon after school. She had been struggling with her grades and hoped the quiet spot would help her concentrate. It didn't. Claire later described a sensation she couldn't quite explain. It started with an almost imperceptible sound, a soft, faint tapping like fingernails on a desk. But when she looked around, no one was nearby. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just her imagination. But it didn't stop. Then the tapping began to grow louder, closer. Looking down at the table in front of her, Claire noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small old book lying open in the middle. The pages were yellowed, the text faded, and there was no title on the cover. What was strange, however, was that it was written in handwriting she didn't recognize. The words seemed to move on their own, shifting and changing as she read, like the book was alive. Claire couldn't tear her eyes away from it. That's when she heard the whispering. At first, it was just a low murmur, impossible to decipher. But then the words became clearer. It was calling her name, over and over again. Claire. Frozen, she turned the page. And on the next page, her name appeared in the text, as if someone had written it there in real time. The tapping turned into a rhythmic scratching, like nails dragging across the floor. Claire's heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, now echoing all around her. She looked up. Nothing but empty chairs. But in the corner of her eye, she saw something. A figure standing just beyond the bookshelves. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, its body seemingly made of shifting shadows. It was dark, like a hole in reality, and it had no face. Only two glowing white eyes, burning with a cold intensity. It stepped forward, but Claire couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, her breath caught in her chest. Suddenly the book slammed shut and the whispering stopped. The figure was gone. The tapping ceased. The entire library was silent. Claire ran from the alcove, slamming into the bookshelves, her heart racing. She never told anyone about what had happened that day, not until months later, when another student named Ethan sat in the same spot, hoping to study. He didn't come back. When the police investigated, they found his belongings in the alcove. His bag was left open, his books scattered on the floor, but Ethan was nowhere to be found. The footage from the library security cameras was corrupted, completely blank except for one still image of Ethan sitting in the alcove, his eyes wide with terror. Then the picture flickered and a shadow passed by him. The school shut down the library for an entire week after that. But rumors spread. Some students claimed to have seen the shadowed figure standing in the alcove after hours. Others said they heard whispers too in the empty hallways. A year later, a group of students decided to investigate, determined to debunk the stories. They brought cameras, flashlights, and equipment, intending to spend the night in the library. They set up a few basic experiments, trying to catch any paranormal activity. At 2:13 a.m., one of them, a girl named Jennifer, looked up from her phone and froze. She whispered to the others, and they turned toward the alcove. A figure stood there, in the shadows, too tall, too dark, its face hidden beneath the blackness. It didn't move. Then, in a voice that wasn't Jennifer's, a whisper came from the corner of the room. "Why didn't you leave when you had the chance?" They bolted out of the library, but none of them spoke of what they'd seen again. The alcove was eventually sealed off, the section of the library never used again, but late-night workers still report strange noises coming from that part of the building, especially when the wind picks up. And sometimes, if you stand too close to the locked door, you might hear something or someone tapping softly on the other side.
Story number 7.
In 2008, a small high school in rural Maine had a relatively quiet, uneventful reputation. The students were diligent, the teachers kind, and the building itself was as old as the town itself. But that all changed one cold autumn evening when a group of seniors, 3 boys and 2 girls, decided to explore the old boiler room beneath the school. It had been locked for years and mostly forgotten by everyone, except for those who dared to venture near it. The school's basement was an odd place to begin with. It was vast, made up of twisting, narrow hallways that led to rooms no one seemed to know the purpose of. There was the storage area, a room with shelves upon shelves of old desks, textbooks, and various random school equipment. There was also the boiler room, which everyone in the school referred to as the heart of the building. It hadn't been used since the 1970s, and the entrance had been sealed off a decade before, after a worker had mysteriously vanished while repairing it. That evening, the group decided to break into the basement. They found a loose grate near the back of the school and used a crowbar to pry it open. They crept inside, whispering excitedly, the air thick with the musty scent of old pipes and damp concrete. The further they ventured, the colder it became, the air thick with a stale smell of decay. After what felt like an eternity, they found the boiler room door, which was cracked open slightly. The rusted hinges creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a massive chamber filled with old, rotting equipment. The air was fetid, and the walls were coated in grime and mold. But there was something else in the room, something that none of them had expected to see. At the far corner of the room, standing motionless in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, draped in a long, flowing dark coat that seemed to blend with the darkness around it. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a hood. There was something about the figure that didn't seem right. It was too still, too silent, and the atmosphere in the room shifted when they first saw it. The temperature seemed to drop, and the air became heavier, harder to breathe. The boys tried to make jokes, but their voices faltered as they approached the figure. One of the girls, Alice, reached out her hand toward the figure, but before she could touch it, there was a sudden shift in the room. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, swallowing the figure whole. The light from their flashlights flickered and then cut out completely. In the pitch darkness, they could hear a low hum, a vibrating sound coming from deep within the walls. Panic surged through the group. The boys turned and ran, but Alice, who had frozen, was still standing in the middle of the room, unable to move. The others screamed at her to run, but she only stared at the spot where the figure had been. And then, without warning, the hum turned into something else. A deep, guttural growl, one that seemed to reverberate in their very bones. Alice's face contorted in fear, and with one final scream, she bolted from the room. The group didn't stop running until they were safely outside, gasping for air in the freezing night. The next day, when they tried to talk to the principal about what happened, no one believed them. The boiler room was locked again, but no one thought to check it. Alice refused to speak about the event and transferred to another school by the end of the semester. The others grew distant from her, unable to forget the fear they had seen in her eyes, the way she had looked when she stood still, just staring at the dark corner of that room. A few months later, the school underwent renovations and the old boiler room was sealed off permanently. But before they did, the workers who were sent to clear out the area reported something disturbing. Inside the room, amid the decay and forgotten machinery, they found something that should never have been there, a series of old photographs pinned to the wall. They were all black and white portraits of students, none of whom anyone recognized. There were no dates on the backs of the pictures, but one thing stood out to the workers. Each photo had a single word written in red ink across the bottom: watch. It was never clear who had taken the photos or how they had ended up in that room. But as far as anyone was concerned, the story of the boiler room faded into obscurity until a few years later, a janitor found a picture pinned to the wall in the very same school hallway. It was a new photo of Alice. Her eyes were wide with terror, and written across the bottom was one word, smeared with what appeared to be blood: You're next." The janitor swore that for a split second, just before the picture fell, he saw something in the shadows, a figure, tall and draped in a long coat, watching from the corner of the room.
Story number 8.
In 2012, at a prestigious prep school in New Hampshire, the students began noticing something off about the school's notorious bell tower. The tower had been there for over a century, towering above the school like a silent sentinel. Most students never gave it much thought. It was just part of the scenery. However, this was before the rumors began. The bell tower had always been a mystery. The bell had stopped ringing many decades ago, and the tower had been locked off to students since the school had undergone renovations in the late 80s. The school's administration claimed it was structurally unsound and too dangerous to allow anyone near. The tower was forgotten, locked away in the old part of the building that only the maintenance crew visited. But in the fall of 2012, a group of curious seniors, friends since freshman year, decided to investigate. They had heard stories about the bell tower, rumors passed down by older students about strange sounds coming from the tower at night. Some claimed to hear a distant toll of the bell when it hadn't rung in years. Others said they saw strange figures moving in the windows, figures that seemed to appear after hours, their movements jerky and unnatural. The group of friends, Megan, Kyle, and Alex, dared each other to sneak into the tower one evening after lights out. They had no idea what they were about to uncover. That night, they gathered their flashlights and made their way to the tower. They knew the only way in was through a service entrance at the back of the building, which had been left slightly ajar. The rusted stairs creaked under their weight as they ascended toward the tower's entrance. The closer they got, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, and an inexplicable sense of dread seemed to settle around them. When they reached the top, the door to the bell tower was slightly open, as if someone or something had been waiting for them. As they pushed the door open, the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. The room inside was unnaturally cold, filled with an old musky smell. The walls were lined with dusty old wooden beams, and in the center of the room stood the bell, large and imposing, yet strangely still. But it wasn't the bell that caught their attention. It was the strange markings on the floor, scratches, claw-like grooves etched into the wood, leading to the base of the bell. And in the far corner of the room, there was a small, dilapidated chair. Someone had been sitting there. Kyle, unable to resist, walked toward the chair. As his flashlight beam moved across the room, he caught sight of something moving in the shadows. It was only for a split second, but it was enough. The shape seemed to flicker, like a mirage, before disappearing completely. Megan gasped and pointed her flashlight toward the spot, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the tower. The bell, despite being dormant for decades, had just rung. The three of them froze, the sound vibrating in their chests, but there was no wind, no mechanism that could explain it. The bell hadn't moved at all, yet they all heard the toll. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, almost inaudible, but they grew louder, voices muttering in the corners of the tower just beyond their vision. The air grew even colder, and their breath began to fog in front of them. Megan, her voice trembling, said, "We need to leave, now." But before they could turn around, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The whispers grew into frantic murmurs, like dozens of voices all speaking at once. The trio scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, inching toward them, and then the bell rang again, this time louder, so loud that it shook the very walls of the tower. Kyle's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch black, they could hear something moving, scraping against the floor. It was slow and deliberate. Megan screamed, "What is that?" Her voice echoed back at her, distorted. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The bell rang once more, but now it was different. It sounded distorted, like a scream. The door to the tower flew open with such force that it sent all three students tumbling to the floor. They bolted down the stairs without looking back, their hearts pounding in their chests. The next morning, they tried to speak about what had happened, but no one would believe them. The bell tower was locked again, this time with extra security measures. The school officials claimed it had been an electrical malfunction, but Megan, Kyle, and Alex knew what they had seen, and they knew what they had heard. A few months later, as winter break approached, an unexpected snowstorm hit the area. The storm was so severe that the school had to remain closed for several days, and no one was allowed to return to the building. But late one night, a janitor, one who had been working at the school for decades, reported hearing the bell ring once again. It wasn't the loud, distorted clang it had been before. This time it was soft, faint, just a single toll that echoed through the empty halls. When the janitor checked the bell tower, he found the door ajar. Inside, the chair was empty, but the claw marks were still there, and in the center of the room, the bell stood silent. Then, as he turned to leave, he saw something reflected in the cracked mirror on the far wall. A shadow.
Story number 9.
In the early 1990s, there was a private high school nestled in a remote part of Oregon, surrounded by thick woods and miles away from the nearest town. The school had a long history, and while it was known for its rigorous academics, there was one place that no student or teacher would dare to go: the old chapel at the edge of the property. The chapel had been built in the 1800s and had fallen into disuse decades before. By the time the 1990s rolled around, it was little more than a crumbling structure covered in ivy, its windows long shattered, its roof partially collapsed. The school had intended to tear it down, but it remained standing, a shadow of its former self. Most students didn't think much of it, other than the occasional ghost story told around campfires. That was until Sarah, a freshman with a love for adventure, decided to sneak in. It was a crisp autumn evening when Sarah and a few friends decided to explore the chapel after curfew. The campus was quiet. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Sarah had heard the stories, the ones about the strange happenings in the chapel, the whispered rumors that it had once been the site of strange rituals long ago. But she wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or superstition. So she gathered her friends and set off for the chapel, eager to prove that it was just a building, just an old abandoned structure with nothing but a few broken pews and dust. When they arrived, they found the door ajar, creaking with the wind. Without hesitation, Sarah pushed it open and they entered the chapel. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and decay hung in the atmosphere. The moonlight filtered through the shattered windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The wooden pews, long forgotten, were covered in layers of dirt and cobwebs. They wandered through the room, their flashlights sweeping over the walls, revealing strange markings carved into the wood. But it wasn't until they reached the altar that they saw something that made them freeze in place. In the center of the altar, an old, tattered book was lying open. The pages were yellowed with age, but the text was still legible. The friends gathered around it, drawn by a sense of curiosity and dread. As Sarah flipped through the pages, she felt a chill run down her spine. The text was strange, unfamiliar symbols mixed with Latin, and some of the writing seemed to shift as though it were alive, changing before their very eyes. One word appeared more than once, over and over again: awaken. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The flashlight flickered and went out. The wind outside began to howl, rattling the broken windows. The silence in the chapel was deafening, and it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing in on them from all sides. Without warning, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the chapel, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Sarah spun around, shining the flashlight toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing but the shadows stretching across the room. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, like a breeze passing through the cracks in the walls, but then they grew louder, urgent, desperate. The friends looked around, but no one was there. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, wrapping around them, suffocating them. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light. And then they saw it. A figure, tall, cloaked in darkness, emerged from the shadows, standing at the far end of the chapel just before the altar. It was indistinct, like a black silhouette against the moonlight. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but its presence was undeniable. The friends stood frozen, too terrified to move. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps echoing through the chapel. Each step was slow, deliberate. Sarah tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. She felt like something was pressing against her chest, preventing her from breathing. The figure reached the altar and stood in front of the book. It raised a hand, and with a motion that was both fluid and unnatural, it closed the book. The room fell silent again, and the temperature returned to normal, but the sense of dread remained. Without a word, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, as though it had never been there. The friends rushed toward the door, not daring to look back. The next morning, the group tried to convince themselves that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by the tension and fear of being in the chapel. But when they returned to the altar to investigate further, they found that the book was gone, not just missing, but completely vanished, as though it had never been there at all. That night, Sarah woke up to a strange feeling, a sensation that something was watching her. She sat up in bed looking around the room, but there was nothing there. That was when she heard it. The same whispers, faint and distant, just beyond the edge of her hearing. The whispers had followed her home. The chapel, it seemed, had awoken. From that night on, Sarah was never the same. She became withdrawn, distant from her friends, her eyes constantly scanning the room as though searching for something. The whispers continued, growing louder, more persistent. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the empty corner of her room, a look of fear etched on her face. And sometimes, when she would walk past the chapel on the way to class, she could swear she saw movement in the broken windows, shadows shifting behind the glass. The chapel had a history, one that it was desperate to keep buried. And now it had claimed Sarah, just as it had claimed others before her.